What's up, my guys and geeks? As you all know, I love the MCU, although not some of their recent activities.
It stinks.
But what makes the MCU so amazing is how in some projects they can have the most boring, bland, and forgettable villains you've ever seen put to screen.
You think you can stop this?
And then in the very next project have one of the most compelling villains in cinematic history.
I am inevitable.
So today I decided I'm going to go through the list of all the villains we've gotten in the MCU and rank my top 5 favorite MCU villains from the worst to the best. Alright, if you go on to enjoy this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit that notifications bell for the next awesome video I upload. And be sure to comment your list in the comments down below. My list isn't the right list, it's just my list. But kicking it off in 5th place, we have Baron Zemo.
Super soldiers cannot be allowed to exist.
And Zemo's an interesting character because you get to see different sides of him, drastically different sides, in Civil War and Falcon and the Winter Soldier. In Civil War, he's this brilliant villain who's able to take down the Avengers not through a brawn or sheer power or ability to go toe-to-toe with Thor and Hulk and Scarlet Witch, but rather through his manipulation and his ability to pit the Avengers against each other.
An empire toppled by its enemies can rise again, but one which crumbles from within, that's dead.
He's able to use their own personalities and their own tendencies and character flaws and weaknesses to cause them to cave in upon themselves. And really, he has a huge impact because the Avengers breaking up in Civil War is what ends up leading to Thanos being able to succeed the way he is during Infinity War.
The Avengers broke up. We're toast.
And then Zemo also has a great motivation that his family was killed when the Avengers brought down Sokovia during Ultron's attack. So it gives him a brilliant backstory, it gives him a brilliant plan, and he's able to execute it so brilliantly. And then in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, I think it's interesting because he's not really a villain, so I don't count that as much for my villain ranking. But he is an interesting character because you get to see his mentality and why he so firmly believes against things like the super soldier serum, and how he truly believes that giving people superpowers inevitably creates supremacy, which ends up creating all this conflict and problems later on down the line. So while I didn't factor that as much into my ranking as a villain, I did find that an interesting perspective. But he's an incredible villain who is one of the few to actually successfully beat the Avengers, so he sits here on the list. Next up in 4th place, we've got Killmonger from Black Panther.
Hey, Auntie.
And Killmonger's an interesting character because in many ways he is right. He has a valid point that Wakanda should be doing more to help the world and to help other people, particularly other people of African descent around the globe, that they have a duty to do diplomacy and help support the nations around them.
The wise build bridges, but the foolish build barriers.
But then on the other hand, his methods are so wrong and so brutal and so forceful and so far removed from what is right and what should be done that he has to be stopped at the same time, because his way of achieving that right goal of protecting people around the globe is through war and death and destruction.
And all this death, just so I could kill you.
And just seeing how he was shaped into the person he's become because of past sins in Wakanda, because of T'Chaka's failures to handle his brother properly, because of T'Chaka basically wiping him from the memory and knowledge of all of the people, never mentioning that Njobu had a son.
Dingle and Jadaka! Unyanaka and Jobu!
Never bringing this son to Wakanda. Because of T'Chaka's failures, T'Challa now has to face this enemy who's grown up his entire life preparing for this moment. And so he's an incredibly physically capable villain. He's incredibly intelligent. He had a plan and knew how to execute it and was perfectly able to take the throne. And just there's something that makes for a really compelling villain when they're right in a lot of ways and they force the hero to change their perspective. But next up, in third place, we've got the Green Goblin from Spider-Man No Way Home.
Poor Peter. Too weak to send me home to die.
And honestly, I kind of feel like they did Goblin better in No Way Home than they did in the original Spider-Man movie almost, because they do such an excellent job of showing the conflict between Norman Osborn, who really is just this decent guy who, you know, he may be a little bit too driven, he may be a little bit too power hungry at times, but he's overall just a guy who is tired of being manipulated by Goblin, who is tired of being forced to do these horrible things. He just wants this to stop, and he's thrown into this other universe, and it's a complete shock to him. His family's gone, his company doesn't exist, he has no idea what's happening, and you get to see how broken and almost fragile that makes him.
Oscorp doesn't exist.
And then on the other side, you get to see Green Goblin and how he's such a terrifying villain. How he really wants to push these heroes, how he really wants to push Spider-Man to becoming the worst version of himself.
I just want to kill you myself.
Attaboy.
For him, it's not just about defeating Spider-Man or making Spider-Man become demolished or taking everything away from Spider-Man. It's about making Spider-Man lose his humanity himself. He wants Peter to kill him and to really become this worst version of himself. And you see that during his final fight. He's incredibly dynamic. He's a captivating villain every time he's on screen. Willem Dafoe does a beautiful job portraying this character and portraying both sides of him. And really just Goblin's such a terrifying villain. I think back to that time when Peter is just on top of him, wailing on him, punching him, and Goblin's just smiling and laughing louder and louder and louder, and just how terrifying of a villain that makes someone where you hit them harder and they just seem to get more amped up, more keyed up, seem to enjoy it more.
Does Spider-Man come out to play?
After the fact. So he's just an incredibly compelling and fascinating villain. Alright, before I get into my top 2 MCU villains, be sure to join me in the comments down below. Let me know who your top 5 favorite MCU villains are, or maybe just who are some of your least favorite and who are some of your favorite. But alright, moving on into second place, we have Loki.
I am Loki of Asgard.
And Loki's interesting because he starts off his journey really as kind of the epitome of a spoiled brat. He believes that he deserves the throne, he wants the throne, he desperately wants power and to rule and to lord over all these people. And you get to see how the different events of his life has really shaped him. How he was taken from the Frost Giants as a baby, and so he's always been kind of treated somewhat as an outsider by Odin, and how that really influenced him growing up, how he always felt like he was made to be less than Thor, how he was never as accepted as Thor, and there was, unbeknownst to him, a reason for that, because he was a Frost Giant, and he could never really take the throne of Asgard simply by nature of being a Frost Giant. And so he's an incredibly compelling villain. And then I didn't really count any of his journey after he stops becoming a villain and becomes more of an anti-hero, because I'm just purely ranking these characters off of how they function as villains. But simply as a character, he has this amazing character arc that we get to see repeated in many ways, but it's done better each time. You get to see him kind of redeem himself in Dark World. He helps somebody still looking out for himself. You get to see him redeem himself even more through Ragnarok, where he's still kind of cocky and self-serving, but he's also willing to help fight to save Asgard. Then we get to Infinity War, and he's willing to lay down his life to stop Thanos.
We'll never be.
And then you get to Loki, and you get to see his redemption all over again.
And I am burdened with glorious purpose.
And you really get to, by the end of Loki Season 2, see him come to the best version of himself. One that's willing to take the throne, not because he wants power, but because he's willing to sacrifice himself and his freedom and his ability to do things in order to protect his friends. But even casting all that aside, just as a villain, Loki is incredibly compelling, and so he sits at number 2. But in first place, as we all knew he would be, the Mad Titan himself, Thanos, my favorite MCU villain.
You should have gone for the head.
Thanos is interesting because aside from Loki, he's really the only character who's a villain, but he's the main character of the story. He really is the main character of Infinity War. And I think they did a wonderful job transforming his story from the comics into the MCU, because in the comics he was just obsessed with death and he was trying to impress Lady Death, and that's the reason he embarked on this journey. Whereas in the MCU they reinvented him to be kind of this tragic figure. Really, he saw his own planet die out from overpopulation and he tried to stop it from happening, and when he failed, ultimately that strengthened his resolve. He decided that he was going to prevent that from happening anywhere else. And you see how he really believes he's doing the right thing, but his methods are so barbaric and so ridiculously cruel, wiping out half of all life on first individual planets and then throughout the universe, that you see why our heroes have to stop him. You see that he poses a physical, a mental, a philosophical, a moral threat and opposition to our heroes. He forces them to make the hard decisions. He forces them to consider, do we need to sacrifice a vision to stop Thanos, or do we not? Thanos is willing to make all the sacrifices in order to achieve his end goal, and he kind of forces the Avengers to reconsider what they're willing to sacrifice and how far they're willing to go to stop such a powerful threat.
I know what it's like to lose. To feel so desperately that you're right, yet to fail all the same.
And so he's just incredibly powerful. He's incredibly interesting and complex. You get to see his relationship with his daughters, particularly Gamora. You get to see how in his own incredibly twisted way, he really does care for Gamora. But he's so strongly convinced that he's doing the right thing, that his way is the right way, that he's completely blinded to everything else, and he's willing to sacrifice himself, really, to achieve his end goal.
What did it cost?
Everything.
He's willing to die in pursuit of this quest, even as long as he's able to complete that quest. But just overall, his incredibly complex nature and the great motivation they gave him makes Thanos my favorite MCU villain. But alright, that's my list. Be sure to give me your list in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit that notifications bell for the next awesome piece of MCU content I upload. If you want to see me rank all the heroes in the MCU on an epic tier list, you can click on this side of the screen. And if you want to see me rank every MCU project from worst to best, you can click on this side of the screen. But you've only got 3 seconds because this video is about to end. Adios!